The audio opens with the roar of a summer night concert. Open air, the crowd's voices tangled with the fading strains of Elvis singing his final verse. Then, without warning, the music cuts out. A thin, trembling child's voice rises in the hush. "Mr. Presley, could you be my dad, just for one day?" The words hang in the air. Laughter ripples through the audience. They think it's a joke. But Elvis doesn't smile. His eyes lock on something in the shadows near the stage, the warmth in his face replaced by a deep, searching stillness. He steps back from the microphone, and the crowd instinctively quiets. Narrator's voice, low and measured. No one there knew why that child asked such a thing. And no one imagined that Elvis's answer would silence thousands and leave even those who never cared for his music wiping their eyes. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. It was the summer of 1975, the kind where the heat lingered in the cracks of the sidewalks and the smell of freshly cut grass hung in the air like a stubborn memory. In a quiet town in western Tennessee, a boy named Jimmy sat on the front porch of his family's small, paint-chipped house. He was 10, with sunburned arms and a pair of sneakers whose soles were nearly worn flat. Just a year before, his father had been killed in a construction accident, one of those tragedies that was spoken of quietly in the neighborhood, as if raising your voice about it might make it hurt more. Since then, Jimmy's mother had taken on 2 jobs: mornings at the diner pouring coffee for the regulars, and evenings cleaning rooms at the only motel on the edge of town. It was the only way to keep food on the table for Jimmy and his 7-year-old sister, Carol. Jimmy's love for Elvis Presley didn't come from posters in a record shop window or chatter on the schoolyard. It came from the nights before everything changed, when his father would pull the old portable record player into the living room, drop a vinyl onto the turntable, and let the warm crackle bloom into "Love Me Tender" or "Can't Help Falling in Love." They'd sit together on the couch, his dad's arm around him, the room lit only by the faint amber glow of a single lamp. It wasn't about music then. It was about feeling safe, about knowing someone was there. Now, when Jimmy played those same records alone, the scratches seemed deeper, the silence between tracks heavier. But it was still the closest thing he had to talking with his father. The town itself hadn't changed much in decades. The school playground's metal slides were blistering hot in the sun. The basketball hoops had nets that were little more than frayed rope. Along Main Street, a few storefronts still had buzzing neon signs that flickered at night. Bright pink cursive letters promising cold sodas or fresh pies. A Coke from the vending machine outside the hardware store still cost a dime, and Jimmy had learned to pry open the return slot with a popsicle stick to fish for forgotten nickels. One sticky afternoon, word drifted through town like smoke. Elvis was coming to Memphis, performing at the Mid-South Coliseum. It was only 50 miles away, but for Jimmy, it might as well have been the other side of the world. Tickets cost $15, a fortune in a household where every cent was counted twice. $15 was almost a full week of his mother's pay from the diner. Still, the idea of hearing that voice live, of standing in the same room as the man whose songs carried his father's memory, took hold of him and refused to let go. It wasn't about a handshake or an autograph. Jimmy wanted, just for a minute, to feel like his dad was there again. He started collecting change in secret. At first it was coins from bottle returns, then tips from carrying groceries for Mrs. Taylor down the street, then a few quarters earned sweeping the dusty floors of Mr. Baxter's gas station. The old man would toss him a rag and point at the pump windows, muttering, "Don't smear 'em." Jimmy didn't care. Each coin clinking into the jar under his bed brought him closer. When his mother found out, she tried to put a stop to it. "Baby, It's too far. We can't afford it. And if you get there, you'll be way up in the rafters. You won't even see him proper." But Jimmy wouldn't hear it. He wasn't looking for a perfect view. He just wanted to be there. The argument sat heavy between them for days. She knew what Elvis meant to him. It was tied up in the memory of his father in ways she could hardly bear to think about. Yet the idea of him traveling alone, of chasing something that might leave him disappointed, gnawed at her. Then, as if fate had been listening in, help came from an unlikely corner. Earl Simmons, a quiet man who ran the bait shop and mostly kept to himself, overheard Jimmy talking about Elvis while refilling the soda cooler at Baxter's. Earl was a Vietnam veteran, built like a wall and always wearing a faded army cap. He'd never been much for small talk, but something in the boy's voice must have caught him. "Memphis, huh?" he said, leaning on the counter. "I got business out that way next Saturday. If your mom's okay with it, I can give you a lift." Jimmy almost dropped the pump handle. "For real?" Earl just nodded once, as if offering a ride to see Elvis was no different than giving someone a lift to the next town over. That night, Jimmy brought it up to his mother. She hesitated, weighing trust and fear in the space of a long silence. Earl wasn't family, but he was respected in town. And maybe, just maybe, this was something her boy needed, something she couldn't give him herself. "All right," she said at last, her voice soft but steady. "If you promise to stick by him every second." Jimmy lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, the summer air thick in his room. He could almost hear his father's voice saying, "Looks like you're gonna see the king, kiddo." For the first time in a long while, the future felt like it held something more than empty evenings and the sound of a record spinning in an empty room. It felt like something was about to change. The Saturday morning of the concert broke warm and windless, the kind of day where the sun was already burning off the thin mist on the fields before most people were awake. Jimmy was up before the birds, his shirt buttoned crooked in his rush, hair still damp from the sink. The old coffee pot gurgled in the kitchen while his mother packed a paper bag with 2 sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of lemonade. She tried to keep her hands busy, as if fussing over the food could keep her from worrying. Earl's battered Ford pickup rumbled into the driveway just after 7. The cab smelled faintly of motor oil and tobacco. Earl didn't waste words. He just tipped his cap to Jimmy's mother and said, "We'll be back tonight." Jimmy climbed in, clutching the envelope with his ticket, like it was a secret he couldn't let the wind snatch away. The 2-lane highway stretched out ahead of them, lined with rows of soybeans and faded billboards for roadside diners. As they got closer to Memphis, the flat fields gave way to strip malls and brick buildings, their painted signs chipped by time. The traffic thickened, and for the first time in his life, Jimmy saw more cars than he could count, moving in the same direction. By the time they reached the Mid-South Coliseum, the parking lot was a living thing, streams of people flowing toward the big concrete shell of the arena. Vendors waved pennants, women in bright floral dresses clutched programs, and men in flared trousers and wide lapel jackets laughed loudly over the hum of anticipation. Some fans carried Polaroid cameras around their necks, ready to capture the night on the spot. Jimmy had never seen so many people smiling at the same time. His ticket read, Section 318, Row J. So high up he would be staring down at the stage from a dizzy distance. Still, just holding it felt like holding a piece of treasure. Earl walked him to the entrance, handed him the brown paper bag, and said, "I'll be waiting in the truck when it's done. Don't rush. Enjoy it." Then he melted back into the crowd, leaving Jimmy to climb the wide concrete steps into a world that felt larger with every echoing footfall. Inside, the air smelled of popcorn, cigarettes, and the faint metallic tang of cold soda from the concession stands. Ushers in maroon jackets pointed people toward their sections. Jimmy craned his neck at the vaulted ceiling, where banks of lights hung like giant stars waiting to be switched on. He found his seat, but the distance gnawed at him. Down below, the stage glimmered, still empty, but set with amplifiers, microphones, and a drum kit whose chrome caught the light. Behind it all hung a curtain as red as a fresh wound. As people shuffled in, Jimmy couldn't sit still. He edged toward the stairwell, then further down, his sneakers slapping the concrete. Near the side of the stage, a heavy black curtain marked the entrance to the backstage area. A man in a short-sleeved work shirt was coiling cables, his face shiny with sweat. Jimmy hesitated, then stepped closer, trying to glimpse whatever lay beyond the curtain. The man looked up. "You lost, kid?" No, sir. I just wanted to see where Elvis comes out." There was something in the boy's earnestness, his grip on that crumpled paper bag, the way his voice faltered, that softened the man's expression. He set the cable down, wiped his hands on a rag, and crouched to Jimmy's level. "Where's your folks?" "My mom's back home. Earl, he gave me a ride." Jimmy didn't explain more, though his voice carried the truth in its cracks. The man studied him for a moment, then tilted his head toward a spot just beyond the curtain. "If you stand there, you'll see him come right past before he goes on. But you keep to the side and don't get in the way. Deal?" Jimmy nodded so hard his hair flopped into his eyes. He slipped into the space indicated, a narrow lane lined with cases stamped in white letters. Elvis Presley Productions. The murmur of the crowd was louder here, a restless ocean on the other side of the curtain. While he waited, two uniformed security men nearby traded low remarks. One chuckled, "You know, the boss has a thing for giving away watches. Somebody does him a good turn. Next thing you know, they're walking out with a gold Omega on their wrist." The other shook his head, grinning. Guys got more heart than sense sometimes. Jimmy pretended not to listen, but the words lodged in him. Not because he cared about a watch, he couldn't imagine wearing something so fine, but because it painted a picture of Elvis as more than a voice on a record. Someone who noticed kindness and answered it in kind. Minutes later, a tall man in a rhinestone-studded vest brushed past, carrying a guitar case. He paused when he saw Jimmy. "You here by yourself?" Jimmy swallowed, suddenly shy under the man's curious gaze. I came to see him. I've been saving for a year." The man's brows lifted. "That's so?" He opened his mouth as if to ask more, but a voice somewhere backstage called for him, and he moved on, giving Jimmy a nod. The house lights dimmed. The crowd roared, the sound pressing against Jimmy's chest. Somewhere beyond the curtain, footsteps were approaching. Steady, unhurried, yet heavy with the kind of presence that could bend the air in a room. Jimmy's heart raced. This was it. He was close enough now to see what no ticket could promise. And somewhere deep in him, a thought began to take shape. If this was his one chance, he wasn't going to let it slip by unnoticed. The murmur behind the curtain swelled into a roar as the band struck the opening chords. The floor beneath Jimmy's feet seemed to pulse with the low thump of the bass drum. Spotlights shot out over the crowd, scanning the upper seats before converging on the center of the stage. And then he was there. Elvis strode into view in a white jumpsuit embroidered with gold filigree that caught the lights like tiny suns. The high collar framed his face, and a wide belt cinched his waist, its buckle gleaming. His hair, thick and dark, curled slightly at the ends, and his smile, easy, practiced but warm, sent the first row into an eruption of cheers and waving hands. Jimmy felt his breath hitch. This wasn't the man on the album covers. This was someone larger than the photographs could hold, moving with a grace that was both casual and commanding. Each step across the stage was its own kind of music. The first few songs came in a rush, drums snapping, guitars buzzing, Elvis pivoting to face each section of the arena. The audience clapped in rhythm, women in the front stretching out programs and scarves, hoping for a touch. From his narrow gap near the curtain, Jimmy had an almost direct view of the side of the stage. He could see Elvis take a quick sip of water between verses, accept a towel from a stagehand, and toss it into the crowd, where a dozen hands fought to claim it. Then, between numbers, something in Jimmy pushed against the knot of awe in his chest. The words were there, raw and trembling, demanding to be heard. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Elvis! Will you be my dad for just one day?" The sound was small compared to the tidal noise of the audience, but it carried. A few people nearby turned, startled. And on stage, Elvis paused mid-step. The band kept strumming softly, uncertain. He turned his head toward the source of the voice. His eyes scanned the shadows near the curtain until they found Jimmy. For a heartbeat, the noise of the Colosseum thinned in Jimmy's ears, as if the whole place had drawn in a single breath and held it. Elvis walked to the edge of the stage, leaning slightly to get a better look. His expression shifted from the broad, generous smile of performance to something quieter, more focused. He gestured with a hand, and one of the security men glanced at him, then at Jimmy. A moment later, the guard was beckoning the boy forward. Jimmy's sneakers squeaked against the floor as he stepped into the light, squinting up at the figure above him. His heart thudded so loudly he was sure it could be heard through the microphones. Elvis crouched down a little, the microphone now hanging loosely in one hand. In a voice pitched so the front rows could hear, he asked, "Why'd you ask me that, son?" Jimmy's mouth felt dry. He swallowed hard and said, "Because my dad, he can't anymore." For an instant, Elvis didn't move. His gaze held steady on the boy, the noise of the crowd dissolving into an expectant hush. The pause wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, as though he was letting the weight of the words settle. Then, without looking away, Elvis rose and spoke into the microphone. "Folks, this young man here, he just told me something that deserves a little more than a hello." The crowd murmured, unsure where this was going. Elvis nodded to the guard, who gently guided Jimmy toward the short set of stairs at the side of the stage. As Jimmy climbed, the lights seemed to sharpen around him, making each step feel unreal. By the time he reached the top, Elvis was there, offering his hand. Jimmy took it, the skin warm and dry, the grip firm but careful, like holding something breakable. The arena, vast and glittering under the lights, seemed to lean in toward them. Jimmy could feel thousands of eyes on his back, but all he saw was the man in front of him, tilting his head slightly as though to say, "It's all right. You're safe here." For the first time since his father's funeral, Jimmy felt something click into place inside him. Not a replacement, not an erasure of loss, but a bridge between the ache of what was gone and the possibility of what could be, if only for a moment. Elvis squeezed his hand once, turned to the microphone again, and with a faint smile said, "Let's make some music for my boy here tonight." The crowd erupted, but Jimmy barely heard them. His gaze was locked on Elvis, the stage lights haloing him in gold. In that instant, the boy knew something had shifted forever. The noise from the audience rolled forward like a wave, then broke into scattered applause as Elvis kept hold of Jimmy's hand. Instead of launching into the next song, he stepped closer to the boy and bent just enough so their faces were near level. The microphone hung loosely in his right hand, the cord looping across the stage floor. His voice, low enough to be almost private, carried only to Jimmy's ears. "You stick close to me now, all right?" Jimmy nodded, unable to speak. Straightening, Elvis turned to face the sea of people and raised his free hand for quiet. The arena responded, cheers softening, conversations breaking off, until the place felt smaller, more contained, like the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. "This young fella," Elvis said, giving Jimmy's arm a light squeeze, "is gonna be my son for the rest of the night. And I'll tell you something. I think that's the best thing that's happened to me all week." A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Some clapping, others whistling, some just staring. Elvis motioned toward the center of the stage, leading Jimmy there with him. A stagehand, wide-eyed, quickly pulled over a padded stool from near the drum riser. Elvis guided Jimmy onto it, setting him just off to the side of his own mic stand. From this new vantage point, Jimmy could see everything. The arcs of light sweeping over the crowd, the way the brass section's horns caught the glare, the sea of faces stretching upward into the rafters. But what gripped him most was how many of those faces were fixed not on Elvis, but on him. Elvis slung his guitar over his shoulder, adjusted the strap, and stepped to the microphone. "Let's do this one different tonight," he said to the band. They nodded, exchanging quick glances. Without looking at his set list, Elvis strummed a soft chord, the opening to "Love Me Tender." The hall went still, except for the gentle ripple of the melody. He began to sing, not outward toward the tears of fans, but inward, toward the boy perched on the stool. Every note seemed aimed at Jimmy alone. Jimmy's hands trembled in his lap. The words of the song, ones he'd heard in the crackle of the family record player so many times, felt new, reborn in this moment, framed by the warmth in Elvis's voice and the way his gaze softened at each line. Somewhere near the front, a camera flashed. A journalist for the Memphis Press Scimitar was jotting notes even as he snapped another picture. Up in the balcony, a woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. By the second verse, the audience had adjusted to this unexpected turn. They leaned in, many swaying gently, as though unwilling to break whatever spell had been cast. The final chord faded into a hush so deep Jimmy could hear the faint buzz of the amplifiers. Elvis stepped back from the mic, removed the guitar, and set it gently on its stand. Then he handed Jimmy a paper cup of water from the side table, the same place he kept his own. The boy took it with both hands, sipping carefully, suddenly aware of the enormity of being treated not as a stage prop, but as someone who belonged here. Two security men stood off to the side, shifting uncertainly. One leaned toward the other. "Should we?" The other shook his head quickly. Whatever the protocol was, this was not the moment to enforce it. Elvis glanced at them and gave the smallest shake of his head, his expression making clear that the boy was staying right where he was. Without any announcement, he launched into Hound Dog, the tempo snapping the arena back into motion. Jimmy watched as Elvis pivoted, laughed, and let the music take over. But every few measures, he'd glance back toward the stool, just a flick of the eyes, a check-in, as though making sure the boy was still with him. By the time the song ended, Jimmy's fear had thinned into something else, a lightness he hadn't felt in months. The stage, the lights, even the thousands of strangers no longer seemed daunting. For the rest of the set, Jimmy sat there as if he'd been part of the act all along, absorbing each chord, each shift in rhythm, each wave of applause that crashed across the stage. What the audience didn't know, and what Jimmy couldn't yet imagine, was that the night was far from over. The final encore bled into a sustained cheer, the kind that rattled the rafters. Elvis gave the crowd a last sweeping bow, then turned toward Jimmy and offered his hand again. The boy slid off the stool, his knees still unsteady from the weight of the moment. Together, they stepped toward the side stairs, away from the glare and into the muted amber glow of the backstage corridor. The hallway felt cooler, lined with concrete walls painted a dull cream. The sound of the crowd muffled quickly behind them, replaced by the rustle of equipment cases and the low chatter of crew members breaking down the set. Elvis walked at an easy pace, letting Jimmy keep up without hurrying him. At the end of the corridor, a door stood open to a dressing room. Inside, a mix of scents hung in the air: aftershave, coffee just poured into paper cups, and the faint sharpness of hairspray. On the table against one wall sat a spread of fruit, sandwiches, and half-drained bottles of soda. Jimmy froze just inside the doorway. His mother was there. She had her purse clutched tight to her side, her expression a mix of relief and apology. She stepped forward quickly, brushing her hands over his shoulders as if to confirm he was really there. "I'm sorry if—" she began, glancing toward Elvis. "He didn't mean to—" Elvis shook his head before she could finish. "Ma'am, there's nothing to be sorry for." His tone carried no hint of irritation. If anything, it was almost gentle. He looked toward the handful of people in the room, 2 members of the band, a security guard, and a man in a suit who seemed to be handling paperwork. "Would you mind giving us a few minutes?" It wasn't a request so much as a quiet instruction. One by one they stepped out, closing the door behind them. The dressing room seemed larger, with just the 3 of them. Elvis set his microphone belt pack on the counter and eased himself into one of the upholstered chairs, motioning for Jimmy and his mother to sit across from him. "Why don't you tell me a little about him?" Elvis said, gesturing toward the boy. "And about your husband." The words settled into the space between them. Jimmy glanced at his mother, unsure if she would speak first. She did. My husband, he worked construction. He used to play your records for Jimmy at night. Said it was the best way to end the day." Her hands smoothed an invisible crease in her skirt. "Last year, there was an accident on site. He didn't come home." Jimmy stared at the carpet, tracing the pattern of faded swirls with his eyes. "I kept playing the records after," he murmured, "because it made it feel like he was still there." For a moment, Elvis didn't reply. He leaned back in his chair, elbows on the armrests, studying the boy's face. There was no stage smile now, just a kind of quiet concentration, as if he were measuring his next words. "You know," he said finally, "I didn't have much of a father growing up either. My mama, she did everything she could, but there's some things a boy misses when there's no man at home." His voice carried no self-pity, just fact. Jimmy's mother shifted in her seat. "I didn't want him to bother you tonight," she said. "I thought maybe it would be too much." Elvis waved it off. It wasn't too much. Sometimes the unexpected's the only part worth remembering. He stood then, walking over to a wardrobe rack in the corner. Rifling through a few items, he pulled out a folded towel, still faintly damp from the stage, and set it on the table. Beside it, he placed a small silver pen from his jacket pocket. "But I think we can do better than a towel," he said, a faint smile returning to the edge of his mouth. "What are you 2 doing tomorrow?" Jimmy's mother blinked. "Tomorrow?" "I'd like to spend the day with you," Elvis said plainly. "No photographers, no reporters, just us. A proper day. I figure if I'm going to be a dad for a night, might as well do it right." Silence hung for a heartbeat, broken only by the faint hum of the dressing room's air unit. Jimmy's mother looked at her son, then back at Elvis. "If you mean that—" "I do," he said. "We'll make it happen." Outside, someone knocked lightly on the door, a reminder that the world beyond was still moving. But for the moment, inside that room, the three of them occupied a pocket of time that felt sealed off from the noise, a place where the edges between fantasy and reality blurred just enough for something true to take root. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains of Jimmy's small bedroom, painting stripes across the floorboards. He was already dressed, his sneakers tapping restlessly against the bed frame. Each passing minute felt swollen, as if time itself were reluctant to move. Out front, the low purr of an engine broke the stillness. Jimmy darted to the window just as a long black Cadillac eased into the driveway. The chrome caught the sun in a clean, sharp line. Earl, standing on his porch across the street, gave a slow whistle. Jimmy's mother stepped outside, Carol clutching her hand. Elvis emerged from the driver's side, wearing a casual jacket and open-collared shirt, his hair neatly in place, but without the stage's perfect gloss. He waved, and the gesture felt startlingly ordinary, as though he might have been any neighbor arriving to pick them up. "Ready?" he asked Jimmy, leaning down slightly as the boy bounded toward him. "Yes, sir," Elvis grinned. "Then let's make a day of it." The Cadillac's interior smelled faintly of leather, and something sweeter, perhaps cologne, and the seats were soft enough that Jimmy almost sank from sight. Carol sat between him and Elvis, her small legs swinging above the carpeted floor mat. The ride toward Memphis was filled with low conversation. Elvis asking about their school, their favorite places to go, their mother occasionally adding a quiet note from the front passenger seat. Their first stop was Graceland. The gates swung open, the ironwork casting lace-like shadows over the drive as they approached. The white-columned facade came into view, framed by the thick green of summer trees. Jimmy had seen pictures in magazines, but nothing compared to walking through those doors and finding himself surrounded by rooms layered with warm woods, soft carpets, and personal touches. A piano in the corner, family photographs on tables, a stack of records by a console stereo. In the backyard, Elvis led them toward the stables. "These are my boys," he said, stroking the neck of a chestnut mare, before introducing them to each horse by name. He lifted Carol gently into a saddle and walked her around the paddock. Jimmy followed, his hand brushing the sleek flank of a palomino that blinked at him lazily. Back inside, Elvis opened a glass case in the music room and took out a guitar, the wood polished to a deep amber glow. He handed it to Jimmy with care. "Go on. Hold it like you mean it." Jimmy set his fingers awkwardly along the fretboard. "I don't know how to play." "You don't have to." "Not yet," Elvis said, adjusting the boy's grip. "But you treat it with respect. It'll give you something back." They stayed at Graceland until late morning, then headed downtown for lunch. Elvis steered them into a narrow diner tucked between a barber shop and a shoe store. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of fried potatoes and fresh pie. The waitress barely blinked at the sight of Elvis, whether out of practiced professionalism or genuine calm, but she smiled warmly at the children. They slid into a booth. Elvis ordered burgers and milkshakes for everyone, adding, "And bring an extra cherry for the little lady here," nodding toward Carol. He told stories between bites, nothing about tours or movie sets, but about fishing trips as a boy, losing a baseball in the neighbor's yard, once accidentally stepping on a hornet's nest. After lunch, they drove to a public park. It wasn't grand, just a few swings, a slide, and a baseball diamond, but the shade from the oaks made it a fine place to linger. Jimmy, still holding on to the earlier conversation, quietly began singing the first verse of "Don't Be Cruel," while pushing Carol on the swing. Elvis caught the tune and, without ceremony, joined in. His voice, even here in the open air, seemed to settle over the park like a warm blanket. A man walking his dog slowed, recognizing the sound before the face. Elvis just tipped his head in greeting, never breaking the song. As the afternoon softened toward evening, they stopped by a small shop selling souvenirs, postcards, keychains, and little figurines. Elvis bought each child a trinket. For Carol, a tiny ceramic horse. For Jimmy, a brass key ring shaped like a guitar. "For when you have your own house someday," he said. Before turning back toward home, Elvis reached into his jacket and handed Jimmy a sealed envelope. "Don't open it now. Tomorrow's soon enough. Think of it as the last part of today's adventure." The Cadillac hummed along the road as the sky turned gold at the edges. Jimmy sat in the back, turning the envelope over in his hands. Outside the window, fields and telephone poles flickered past, but in his mind, the day replayed in slow motion. Every laugh, every step at Graceland, every note sung in the park. He realized, somewhere between the city limits and his own street, that he hadn't thought about what was missing in a long while. For those hours, it had been there again. Not exactly the same, but close enough to remember without hurting. The next day began with the quiet hum of cicadas and the scent of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. Jimmy lay awake long before the sun had climbed past the rooftops, staring at the narrow beam of light sneaking through the curtains. The sealed envelope from Elvis sat on his nightstand, exactly where he'd placed it the night before. He reached for it slowly, as though it might vanish if handled too quickly. The paper was thick and slightly textured. The flap closed with a neat crease. His name was written across the front, in a bold, slanted hand. Jimmy. Carol was still asleep, her breathing soft in the next bed. Jimmy glanced toward the doorway to be sure their mother wasn't coming, then slid a finger under the flap and carefully tore it open. Inside was a glossy photograph. Yesterday, in frozen form. He and Elvis were in the park, both laughing at something unseen. Jimmy holding the borrowed guitar, while Elvis leaned close, his head tilted, as though listening to every note. The sunlight caught in Elvis's hair, and in the picture, it looked like the two of them were the only people in the world. Jimmy turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same looping script, was a message. "To Jimmy, from your pal Elvis. Your dad for a day. Always in spirit." Beneath the photograph lay something small and heavy, wrapped in tissue paper. He peeled back the folds to find a gold pendant shaped like a lightning bolt, the letters TCB engraved in the center. It hung from a fine chain, cool to the touch. Jimmy had seen pictures of it before. He knew it was the emblem Elvis used for his inner circle, taking care of business. But this wasn't a trinket from a store. This was one Elvis had worn. He slipped it over his head, feeling the chain settle against his collarbone. It was heavier than he expected, as if it carried something more than just metal. A creak of the floorboards announced his mother. She stepped into the room, her eyes going first to the pendant. She stopped, pressing a hand lightly to her mouth. "That's not something he gives to just anyone," she said quietly. There was no jealousy or disbelief in her voice, only the weight of understanding what it meant. Jimmy tucked the photograph back into the envelope, but kept the pendant visible. "I'm wearing it to school," he said, half defiant. "You know the other kids might have something to say about that," she warned gently. "I don't care," he replied. "It's mine." At breakfast, he kept the pendant tucked under his shirt, fingers brushing it every few minutes. Carol asked to see the photo, and when he handed it to her, she studied it, as if trying to memorize every detail. Later that morning, as they were clearing the table, there was a knock at the door. The postman stood on the porch, a flat parcel tucked under his arm. "For you," he said, handing it to Jimmy's mother with a curious glance at the return address. She carried it inside and opened it on the counter. Inside was a typed letter, on thick stationery, with Graceland embossed at the top. It was from Elvis's manager, thanking them for the previous day and inviting them to get in touch to arrange another visit. Jimmy's heart pounded. It wasn't just that Elvis had meant what he said. It was that he wanted to keep the connection alive. His mother read the letter twice before folding it carefully. "We'll think about it," she said, but Jimmy could see the corners of her mouth twitch upward, despite her attempt at restraint. That afternoon, Jimmy went outside with the photograph, finding a patch of sunlight on the back steps. He studied it until the edges of the real world seemed to fade, replaced by the bright memory of the park, the sound of laughter, the feeling of being seen. The pendant rested warm against his skin, no longer just a gift. It was a promise, silent but solid. He didn't know when he would see Elvis again, but for the first time since his father's death, the future didn't feel empty. And somewhere deep down, he understood that some things didn't need to last forever to matter for a lifetime. The letter from Graceland sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Jimmy's mother made her decision. Each evening after work, she would pick it up, read the neat lines again, and set it back down as though waiting for the words to change. Jimmy didn't press her. He knew better than to push. But he kept the pendant on, even while sleeping, as if it could quietly make her say yes. On the 4th morning, she came into the living room, smoothing her hair with one hand. "Get your things together," she said. "We're going to Memphis." Jimmy nearly dropped the cereal bowl he was holding. Carol, still in her nightgown, squealed. By mid-morning, Earl's truck was bouncing along the familiar highway, the same road they'd taken on concert night. But this time, there was no nervous knot in Jimmy's stomach. Instead, there was an open, expectant hum, like the feeling before the first note of a favorite song. The gates of Graceland swung inward once again, the driveway crunching under the tires. Elvis himself was waiting near the front steps, hands tucked into the pockets of a dark jacket. When he saw them, he stepped forward with the same easy stride Jimmy remembered from the stage. "There they are," he said warmly. He bent to Carol's level first, asking about her new school shoes, before turning to ruffle Jimmy's hair. "And how's my boy?" Jimmy grinned. "Still taking care of business." Elvis laughed and led them inside. This time, he didn't walk them through the rooms open to the public. Instead, he took them deeper into the house, past a hallway lined with framed gold records, into spaces that felt less like a showplace and more like a home. In the den, a television played softly in the corner while a small dog dozed on the couch. He brought them into a sunlit room where 3 guitars rested on stands. "Pick one," he told Jimmy. "We'll start with something simple." Jimmy hesitated before reaching for a smaller-bodied acoustic with a worn fretboard. Elvis pulled a chair next to his, showing him where to place his fingers for a G chord. His hands were steady, his voice unhurried, guiding the boy through the shapes until the sound came out clean enough to make Jimmy's face light up. "You've got good hands for it," Elvis said. "Not every kid does." For nearly an hour, they sat together, Elvis adjusting a finger here, demonstrating a strum there, until Jimmy could stumble through the first few bars of "Love Me Tender" without stopping. After a short break for sweet tea in the kitchen, Elvis suggested they take a walk around the property. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of magnolia. They wandered past the pool, the bright blue water reflecting the midday sky, and into a shaded grove where a small bench sat beneath an oak. Elvis rested a hand on the back of the bench and looked out over the yard. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't usually open up this much of the place. Most folks only see what I let them. But some people, you can tell they're not here for the show." Jimmy's mother, standing a few steps away, gave a small nod of thanks. There was no trace of the guardedness she'd had during their first meeting. Back inside, Elvis led them into a room Jimmy hadn't seen before. A small library with shelves lined in neat rows. From one shelf, he took down a hard case, set it on the table, and flipped the latches. Inside lay another guitar, its wood a rich honey color, the pickguard engraved with a delicate floral pattern. "I want you to have this," Elvis said, sliding it toward Jimmy. "It's not brand new, but it's played a lot of good songs." Jimmy's eyes widened. "I can't—" "You can," Elvis interrupted gently. "And you will, because now you've got no excuse not to keep learning." Jimmy ran his fingers over the smooth curve of the body, almost afraid to touch the strings. Before they left that afternoon, Elvis walked them to the front hall. "There's some shows coming up," he said to Jimmy's mother. "If you're willing, I'd like you both to come along for a few dates, just as guests, no publicity." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "As long as it stays private." "Of course," Elvis replied. Then, turning to Jimmy, he added in a lower voice, "I'll tell you something about when I was your age. Something I've never told a reporter." And there, by the open door with sunlight streaming in, he shared a brief story about his own longing for a father figure, and how he'd once made a similar request of an uncle who could never quite fill the role. Jimmy didn't tell anyone else about that story. It became theirs alone, a piece of truth folded into the growing fabric of their strange, unexpected friendship. The summer was waning when the letter came. It was shorter than the first, handwritten this time on thick cream paper. Elvis's touring schedule had been set, long stretches on the road, cities stacked back to back. He invited Jimmy and his mother to visit Graceland once more before he left. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping low enough to gild the edges of the magnolia leaves. The Cadillac wasn't out front this time. Instead, Elvis was waiting on the broad porch, leaning one shoulder against a column, dressed in a soft blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Thought we could just sit and play for a while," he said after the greetings were over. He led them around to the side, where a couple of wooden chairs and a low bench faced the expanse of lawn. Jimmy carried the honey-colored guitar Elvis had given him, the strap slightly too long for his narrow shoulders. They sat together on the steps, the wood warm under them, and began trading simple chords. Elvis showed him a few runs he could practice, his voice blending with the strum as he hummed fragments of familiar tunes. As the evening deepened, the air cooled, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass from somewhere beyond the fence. A few cicadas began their chorus, and from the road came the distant murmur of passing cars. "You've come a long way with that guitar," Elvis said, nodding toward Jimmy's hands. "But don't stop here. Music's like breathing. It only keeps you alive if you keep doing it." Jimmy looked up, sensing the shift in tone. "Will I see you again?" Elvis's gaze held steady. "I can't promise that. Life has a way of moving faster than we want it to. But here's what I can promise. You'll always know you had my word for that one day. And that can carry you a long way if you let it." Jimmy's mother watched quietly from the porch, her hands clasped in her lap. Elvis leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "There are two things I want you to do for me. One, help people when you can, especially the ones nobody else notices. Two, keep the music close. It's not just sound. It's a way of remembering the people who can't be with you anymore." Jimmy nodded, his throat tight. When the last of the light began to fade, they stood. Elvis rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "All right, son. Time to let you go back to your own stage." They walked together to the driveway. Elvis hugged Carol first, then Jimmy. The embrace was firm, unhurried, and Jimmy caught the faint scent of aftershave mixed with something warmer, like cedar. When they stepped back, Elvis held his gaze for a moment longer before turning toward the house. Jimmy climbed into the truck beside his mother. As they rolled away, he twisted in his seat to look back. Elvis was still on the porch, one hand raised in a lazy wave. The image stayed with him until the house vanished behind the curve of the road. Years passed. Jimmy grew taller, his voice deepened, and the world moved on. But the gold lightning bolt pendant remained around his neck, its shine dulled by time, but never removed. The photograph stayed safe in a drawer, taken out on quiet evenings when the house was still. When news of Elvis's death came, Jimmy was a young man. He sat at the kitchen table, the radio announcer's voice fading in and out, and touched the pendant with his fingertips. The weight of it was different now, heavier, but also steadier. Later, when Jimmy had a son of his own, he told him the story, not as something grand or unbelievable, but as a truth that had shaped him. And when the boy was old enough to understand, Jimmy placed the pendant in his hand. "This," he said, "is from a man who kept a promise. Not for a lifetime, just for a day." But that day changed everything. The pendant caught the light for a brief moment before the boy slipped it over his head. And in that small act, the connection stretched forward again, across years, across loss, into the quiet certainty that sometimes one moment of kindness can echo far beyond the person who first gave it.